Uzumaki Spiral into Horror is probably one of the biggest letdowns of the year 2024. From a series that not just me, but a lot of people were looking forward to now all becoming just one big joke. And one of the biggest reasons is not because of the story, but more simply the animation. Now, there's always been an argument, especially when it comes to anime and in general animation, that as long as the story is good, then the animation doesn't really matter. And while yes, this argument can be correct a few times, it doesn't always mean that it's always going to be a good argument to be made when the series is going downhill because of its animation. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Uzumaki anime is going to be used as a good example of how animation can completely ruin a series regardless if it has a good story. And it's a shame really, because based on the trailers that were releasing before it came out, a lot of people were really excited to see what this anime had to offer. It was very obvious that the anime was going to try to be faithful to the manga, which is of course the art style, as it was very obvious that just by looking at it, it was very clearly trying to replicate the manga's art style, which already gave a lot of people hope that this is going to be a good adaptation, and it clearly had a lot of effort being put into it. And overall, many people just simply wanted to see Uzumaki have a good adaptation because the original work has not only become a staple in the manga community, but just in horror overall. When people think of horror media, some people always bring up Uzumaki because that series overall is a very creepy, disturbing, and very unique kind of horror, and that's all thanks to none other than the author Junji Ito. So fast forward and episode 1 finally comes out, and really it left a huge impact to the anime community, and it was talked about quite a lot, showing how good the first episode was. Not only did it seem like the manga was coming to life because of the beautiful animation, but also just how scary everything was very quickly. One moment it was all fine, but then the next thing you know, there's a lot of disturbing things going on. And while sometimes it was very obvious, sometimes it was also very subtle, like showing how the town is very mysterious and there's clearly something going on based on the numerous spirals that we see all throughout the first episode. It was very something unusual that we obviously don't ever encounter in real life, but you could just imagine just how uneasy you must feel if you were in this situation. Not just because of how these spirals not only affect the atmosphere, but it also affects the people living in this town too. Like with the girl that we will see all throughout the entire series, Goshima, who has a boyfriend who goes by the name of Suichi, start to see it firsthand, with seeing Suichi's father starting to descend into madness about being obsessed with spirals, so much so that you can kind of already figure out that there's clearly something going on with him and there's a cause for his obsession with spirals. But this wouldn't be the only person that will be affected because of the spirals, as later on we are introduced to a girl who goes by the name of Azami, who at first seems normal, but we later on see that she has something on her forehead. But as time goes on, we start to see that a spiral starts to come out of her, and once that's revealed, we have this very terrifying scene of what this spiral is capable of and how it just simply completely vanishes her as if she never existed. And just everything about that moment really just captivated me to want to keep seeing what will happen next. So it already just tells you just how good of a first episode it was. Not only did it want to make you see more, but also left you with more questions and answers that you wanted to see be answered, hopefully in the near future. And then we get into episode 2, and that's where everything just starts to crash, and we start to notice very quickly that this series is going to go downhill very soon. We went from episode 1 that had beautiful animation, consistency, and being fluid, to now seeing not just one of the worst runnings that I've seen in an anime so far, but also just simply seeing some characters be completely janky, and then seeing some characters have little to no movement whatsoever, that it makes moments that are supposed to be tense and terrifying be looking really goofy because of the way it was animated. Like for example, during the lighthouse scene, when the characters are climbing these stairs that seem to have no end, it's supposed to be this moment of confusion and not really knowing what's going to happen next, to seeing a character look like they're lagging and you wonder why they did this, and then you come to find out that the reason they probably did this was because they couldn't animate the whole movement, so they just simply took shortcuts to make it look like they were moving, but in reality it just looks like they're just simply lagging all over the place, kind of like a character from a video game. And it's not just that, because already just in episode 2 we can see that there's 3D being used in some characters. Now using 3D isn't bad because we've seen it in most recent times that it can work if done right, but the problem is that you have to make sure that it doesn't stand out like a sore thumb when it comes to it. Otherwise, if you're using 3D and 2D combined, the 3D is obviously going to stand out and it's going to make it look all the more weird that it's there, because of just how completely different it is from the rest of the things that are happening that are in 2D. And Uzumaki, no surprisingly, encountered this when you can tell right away when 3D was being used, and it just makes some moments look really just weird and just bad, and you just wonder how did this all happen in just in episode 2 when episode 1 was considered a masterpiece. Well, unsurprisingly, when the conversation was revolving around episode 2 and just how terrible it was, no surprise, there was actually some information being revealed that there was some behind the scenes stuff going on that made episode 2 look so garbage, and is the same typical problems that other anime studios face when it comes to making animes, whether it's sometimes having to deal with bad schedules, bad management, and just overall very bad decision makings that greatly affect the anime and how it's not only done but also how the final product comes out because of all the terrible things happening behind the scenes. And Uzumaki was no exception, as not only terrible decisions were being done with this anime, but there was also a ton of outsourcing being done as well, and the people who were originally working on episode 1 were no longer working on episode 2, making it all the more clear as to why not only the animation changed drastically but also the direction where the anime was going, as different people obviously are going to have different ideas of where the anime should go. And because of that, we get what we have in episode 2 of Uzumaki, and things didn't get better after this, because episode 3, while it wasn't as bad as episode 2, there was still a lot of inconsistency, and there were also moments that I think they were not supposed to be funny, but they just ended up being funny because of just how it was shown. Like, I know sometimes horrors have a habit of putting some comedy into a moment, and usually it can work, but I don't think that's the point of Uzumaki. I don't think it's supposed to be comedic. I think there's supposed to be a ton of moments where you're supposed to feel uncomfortable and terrified at what you're witnessing, now or just simply seeing it as nothing but hilarious because of just how it looks. That being said, the only thing that was still terrifying even after everything that we just went through was the snail people. I think people just turning into snails was always unsettling to see. I don't know if it's just me, but even from the very end, people turning into snails was just terrifying, and I think that was the only good thing that was always consistent, that despite everything that was happening around, that was always the only thing that freaked me out the most whenever it happened. But apart from that, everything else just felt comedic, and I think that's something that happened after episode 2. I think at that point I didn't really see the series as a horror anime. It always felt later on like half horror, half comedy. I don't know why things turn out like this, but we all know why. It's because of course the animation, it just made moments that were supposed to be scary just not scary, and that's probably one of the biggest reasons why so many people are just disappointed. And it just simply got worse and worse as the episodes go by, that even when I was watching the final episode, I just simply did not care anymore. Like, yeah, the story was still there, but everything that we just saw from episode 1 all the way to episode 3, the massive downgrade of quality just made me not really care about the story, which is a shame because I feel like the story is very interesting and very unique. How you don't need a million jump scares, or you don't really need gory scenes to make a horror terrifying. Just simply encountering unknown things that are beyond explanation can make someone just very scared and wonder that if this could happen in real life, how they may encounter something that they don't know what it is or where it came from, but that the only thing that you knew during those moments was just the fear and confusion and just the unsettling situation that you were in. It's something that a lot of people can see, as nobody, regardless of who you are, can be able to not having a reaction and not blaming them if they feel frightened. Not to mention that this could also be a creation of a new phobia, as of course phobias are something that a lot of people tend to have if there's something that just by looking at it can make them scared. And in the case of Uzumaki, seeing the spirals, you can obviously tell that something bad's going to happen or there's something disturbing going to come out because of it. And that is something that I wouldn't be surprised if someone has a phobia. If they happen to read Uzumaki and the next thing you know, they see a spiral in real life, I wouldn't be too surprised if they were terrified to look at it and they wonder if something's going to happen to them if they saw it. And that's one of the brilliance of Uzumaki, and it's no wonder why oftentimes when people think of horror, they sometimes think of Uzumaki, because what Uzumaki is trying to tell us is that fear is everywhere, and the thing that people fear the most is not knowing what is happening and having a ton of questions on something that there may not be a full answer to, and you won't be able to truly understand the answer even if somebody told you that that's the only answer and nothing else could explain it. And that is a very interesting direction to take horror, and it's no wonder why the original manga is praised for it. But sadly, as we oftentimes see time to time, even good stories can be the victims of terrible adaptations, and Uzumaki is the recent one. Despite it having a promising start, it just didn't matter since it wasn't consistent, and it just led to people not watching it any further or just completely dropping it midway because of just the terrible production that it had. Of course, others such as myself wanted to see how it all things end, and no surprise, even though this was a finale, it still had errors, it was still inconsistent, and it were just once again moments that were supposed to be terrifying just simply gave me a laugh because of just how everything looked. And even though the ending was supposed to be like this whole, no matter what anybody did, nothing was going to change the outcome, as eventually later on the town somehow is back to normal and new people live in the town. No surprising, the cycle continues as the reappearance of the spirals comes out once again, meaning that the new people are just going to experience the same thing that the past people have already experienced, and that things are probably not going to end till the end of time itself. And while that would have been a very creative way to end things here, sadly a lot of people probably not really that interested anymore because people just tuned out of it and didn't care in the slightest, and all they really did care to talk about was just simply how this was wasted potential and how this anime could have been something if it was in good hands. But sadly that didn't happen, and now all we got to talk about is just simply how bad everything went after just one episode. And while it is a great shame, I think this also opens up the conversation even more about animation and how people shouldn't just say just because the story is good, it doesn't mean that the animation should be bad. I think every series deserves to have effort put into it, and that includes the animation. I know not every anime is always going to have, Mappa levels or Euphoria levels of animation, but just simply being able to show that people care and are putting the effort into an anime is going to convince people that people are actually putting effort. Can you imagine if series like Frieren or Too Many Losing Heroines had the animation that Uzumaki had? Yeah, it was all going to be hated and people will not care about the anime whatsoever, despite both of those series having a really great story. It doesn't matter if the animation isn't beautifully done. And I hope people now realize that when people say that they want good animation, regardless if the story is good, I hope that they see Uzumaki and now realize why that may be the case and why many people have this thought process. Because even if you have a promising studio, good voice actors, and an interesting story, it all goes down the drain if you don't have good animation, as not only animation makes the storytelling alive, but it could also be the reason why the story gets amplified and could become something even more amazing that will still be talked about all throughout time. And that's where I'm going to end today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.